We continue now at the top of Daf Ayin Daladam and Beis and Mesechet Yevamos. This is Yevamos Daf 74b. The Gemara is bringing the limud that when it comes to truma, if a person is tamei, they can't eat truma. So it said again, if somebody is tamei, so by kadoshim lo yochel. But what the Gemara says, bizarro shel Aaron. What kind of food are we talking about that's equal with the children of Aaron? Rashi over here says, bizarro shel Aaron, bezecharim unekevos. We understand the pasuk is referring to some kind of kachim that's equal with all children of Aaron, meaning whether males or females. Dilu kachei kachim. For example, if we were talking about kachei kachim, that's something that's given to kohanim, but only the kohanim that are males. So therefore, we're talking again, Havi zu truma. The pasuk is talking about truma. It's saying somebody who's tamei cannot eat truma. Gemara says ve'ema bechaza v'shok, but maybe we're talking about the chaza and the shok. Rashi over here says ve'ema chaza v'shok the shlomim. We're talking about a carbon shlomim. So those parts of the animal, the chaza and the hanitan la kohanim, the chaza and the shok are given to kohanim. V'nechol l'neshei, and even their wives are allowed to eat them. Maybe those are the things that somebody who's tamei cannot eat. You can't have chaz v'shok. Aval truma lo, but maybe this halacha doesn't apply to truma. And so the Gemara says, "Eino bechozeres." Rashi over here says, "Umeshani lesa bechozeres bas kohen almona mi Yisrael v'zera ein la." A chozeres is, let's say, the daughter of a kohen, and then she's widowed from a Yisrael. While she's married to a Yisrael, she can't have truma. And then if she has no children, though, and she becomes a widow, so she's allowed to have truma. Damar beperak almona kashi chozeres latruma. But the halacha is she's only chozeres for truma. V'yein chozeres lachaz v'shok. She doesn't go back to eating in the chaz v'shok, and therefore it doesn't apply to all women of Aaron, so to speak, to all the zaro shel Aaron. That would not apply to chaz v'shok. But the Gemara says, 1 second, truma nami. When it comes to truma, also we can think of a woman that is not able to have truma. Eina bechalala, that wouldn't apply to a chalala. Let's say a woman becomes a chalala, so she has some kind of relations that makes her disqualified from the kahuna, so then she's not allowed to have truma. But the Gemara says that's not a problem. Chalala zaro di Aaron he. We don't consider chalala to be the zaro of Aaron, to be the seed of Aaron HaKohen. But the Gemara continues, Umimai dahayar asher yitor ad diiko harav shemesh. How do you know when the pasuk says that these individuals, these kohanim that are tamei, they're not allowed to have truma ad asher yitor? How do you know that it means until the sun goes down? Ema ad demaisi kapara. Maybe it means even they have to bring their carbon, they have to bring the kapara. Rashi over here says, Umimai dahayar asher yitor ad da'avid harav shemesh v'sulo. In other words, we said before that once you have harav shemesh, that's enough. Damar le'el mechusar kippurim mutter b'truma. We said earlier that a mechusar kippurim actually is allowed to have truma. The fact that he didn't bring a carbon is not relevant. So how do you know? Maybe that's what the pasuk means. Maybe the pasuk means ad asher yitor, he has to actually bring his kapara. To that the Gemara says, Lo sal kadaitach, don't think that's the case. The Tana devei Rabbi Yishmael, because it was taught in the yeshiva of Rabbi Yishmael, bezov bal shtei re'iyos of a mitzora muskar hakasa medaber. This pasuk is speaking about a zav who saw only twice, or we're talking about a mitzora, we're talking about a leper who was a muskar, and in those cases it's dumya de tamei nefesh. Both of those cases are similar to somebody who's a tamei mace. Ma tamei nefesh de lav bar kapara, who just like a tamei mace does not even bring a carbon, is not someone who has to bring a carbon. Haninami de labane kapara ninu. The cases over here also are people who don't even have to bring carbonus. In other words, the pasuk is not even talking about a situation of a carbon, so therefore it's clear that we're not saying that you have to bring the carbon. Rashi over here has zav bal shtei re'iyos. What's a zav bal shtei re'iyos? Lav bal karbonu. Let's say a zav only sees 2 emissions. He doesn't have to bring a carbon. Kedetani b'Mesechet Megillah. That's what we learn in Mesechet Megillah. Mana hakasav shtayim v'karu tamei, shalosh v'karu tamei. Pasuk talks about a zav that sees twice, calls that person tamei. Talks about someone who sees 3 times, calls that person tamei. Haketzad, how so? Meaning how are they different? Shtayim l'tumah v'shalosh l'karbon. 2 of them, the person's tamei, but you only have to bring a carbon if he sees 3 times. Umitzora muskar, now by a mitzora muskar as well, nami lav bar carbon, who such a mitzora does not need to bring a carbon. Kedetanan hasam, we learned in the Mishnah over there, ein bein mitzora mitoch hezger latar mitoch hechlet. You have a situation of a mitzora that's made pure. The case of hezger is that the person has been put into isolation, and then we say that he purifies himself after he comes out. He's inspected by the Kohen, and then you also have a mitzora that was declared hechlet, that was declared 100% tamei, wasn't just put in isolation obligation to check to see if it was tamei, but he was declared actually tamei. So what's the difference between those two mitzoras? Ela taglachas v'tziporim. The difference is the shaving, and the difference is the bringing of the birds. V'kevan de taglachas leka carbonami leka. Now, if there's no taglachas, there's also no carbon. De v'hade taglachas ksiv carbon. Together with the shaving is the bringing of the carbon. In other words, that's the difference between the two kinds of mitzora. So mitzora muskar is the kind of mitzora that does not bring a carbon. But the Gemara continues, Ve'ema hanimili delav bar kapara. But maybe that's only true if it's a type of tumah. Again, like the tumahs we just said, zav bal shtei re'iyos, mitzora muskar, etc. So those kind of tumahs that don't require a carbon, so fine, very good. In those kinds of situations, we're going to eat truma. Avol devar kapara. But if a person is tamei with a kind of tumah that requires a carbon, maybe adamaisi kapara. No, maybe enochanami. You do have to bring the carbon in order to eat the truma. As Rashi over here says, Avol devar kapara kegon zav bal shalosh re'iyos, mitzora muchlat. If we would talk about a zav that saw 3 times, or a mitzora that was declared 100% tamei, so in those cases, when the person is purifying, maybe they do need to bring the kapara in order to eat truma. In other words, the fact that you said that the pasuk is talking about zav bal shtei re'iyos and mitzora muskar does not prove that that would be the same in a situation of a mitzora muchlat or a zav bal shalosh re'iyos. And the Gemara continues further, v'su hadetanan, and further, what about the Mishnah that says taval ve'ola ochel b'maiser? It says that after the person immerses, he's now allowed to eat meiser, and hariv shimsho ochel b'truma, and then it says that after the person has hariv shemesh, meaning the sun goes down, then truma is allowed, and hevi kapara ochel b'kachim, and then it says that if the person brings his kapara as carbon, so then he's allowed to have kachim. In other words, it gives these 3 levels in the Mishnah, that taval viola, what we call a tavol yom, can have meiser. When a person has hariv shemesh, then he can have truma. When he brings his carbon, then he can have kachim. So minolan, so where do we learn that out from? And so the Gemara says, Amar Rava says, Amar Rav Chisda, in the name of Rav Chisda, Telasa Kroi Ksivi. There are actually 3 psukim that are written in this regard. Kso yochal min hakodashim. First, the pasuk says he can't eat kachim, ki im rachatz besaro b'mayim, unless he bathes in water. Harachatz tar. That pasuk implies that just the act of immersing in water makes the person pure. Uchsivin, there's another pasuk that says, Uvo hashemesh v'tar. The pasuk says that when the sun goes down, he's pure. V'yachar yochal min hakodashim. Then he can eat from the kachim. Uchsivin, then there's a pasuk that also says, V'chiper aleh hakohen v'toyer, that the kohen does the kapara for her. That's talking about the bringing of the carbon, and that's what makes the individual pure. So which one is it? Is it the immersion? Is it the bias shemesh? Or is it the carbon? And so the Gemara understands, how so? How do we understand these 3 different psukim? Kan lemaiser, kan letruma, kan lekachim. In one case we're talking about meiser, that's where immersing is enough. In one case we're talking about truma, that's where bias shemesh is enough. And in one case we're talking about kachim, that's when you bring the carbon, and only then can you actually have the kachim. The Gemara says ve'epachana, so maybe I should reverse it. How do I know in which direction it is? And the Gemara says mistabra truma adifa. It makes sense to say that truma is actually greater, is actually stronger than meiser. In other words, truma is a higher level, require bias shemesh. Shekein machpaz, because by truma we have the acronym machpaz. Those are the things that are unique. We quoted before when it comes to truma. The Gemara says adrab, on the contrary, meiser adifa. Meiser also has certain things that make it stronger. Shekein hadas tav. That's another acronym. Rashi over here says hadas tav havoas makom. So meiser sheni you have to bring again to Yerushalayim. Vidoy, there's a declaration. Aser la'onein, it's aser to an onein. Ulevar mimenu betuma, and also when it comes to burning it when it's in tumah, that's also a problem. Va'ochlo betumas atzmo loka, and if a person eats it when it is tamei, then the person gets malchus. V'chaya bebir, and there's a chiyuv of bir again of eradicating it from the person's home. And the Rashi explains the acronym over here. Hey stands for Hava, Dalit stands for Vidoy, Samach stands for Asr La'onein, Tes stands for Tumma. Again, that's what he said, Levar Mimenu B'Tumma. Beis stands for Bir, V'Kulu Lesnu B'Truma. All of these qualities do not exist by Truma. And then again, we'll mention that the Mem in Machbaz stands for Misa Bidei Shamayim, that's unique by Truma, and the Ches stands for the Chomesh, the 5th that you pay, and the Pei stands for Pidyon, you're not allowed to redeem Truma, and the Zayin stands for Zar, again, Truma is prohibited to a non-Kohen. And the Gemara continues, Afilu hachi, nevertheless, Misa adifa. By Truma is greater than Meiser, because it has Misa. Misa is something that outweighs the other qualities of Meiser Sheni. So again, that's why by Truma you need Bias Shemesh. By Meiser you will not require Bias Shemesh. Rava Amar, Rava says, below Misa adifa, nami lo matzah samrit. Even without saying that Misa is greater, still you can't say that, because Amar Kron Nefesh, the pasuk when it talks about the Meiser Sheni, the one that's allowed after immersion, it uses the word Nefesh. Ezeu davar sheshava b'chol Nefesh, Well, what are we talking about? What is something that everyone is allowed to eat? Haviyomer zeh meiser. It's clear that pasuk is talking about meiser sheni. That's available to everyone, unlike truma that's only for kohanim. And so therefore, again, the pasuk that says nefesh, the same pasuk that says after the immersion you can have it, that's talking about meiser sheni. But the Gemara continues, V'akati, but still, Lahani mili heicha delav bar kapara. That should all be true in a situation where, again, the person doesn't have to bring a carbon. Aval heicha de bar kapara. But if you'd have a situation where a carbon was required, ad demaisi kapara. So then maybe you still need to bring the actual kapara. Rashi over here says, V'akati ema hani mili the sagi b'harav shemesh l'truma. Maybe by truma, when we said that harav shemesh is enough, heicha delav bar kapara. Again, the same argument. Maybe it's talking about someone who doesn't need to bring a carbon. To amrit bezab. You even said the pasuk is talking about a zob bal shtei re'iyos and a mitzorim muskar. But if a carbon would be required, so then the carbon is needed. It's not enough when the sun goes down. Maybe he can't have truma until he actually brings the kapara. Again, that's what the Gemara says. Maybe by truma he actually has to bring the kapara. And to that the Gemara says, Amar Abai, it says, Trei kroi ksivi bioledis. There are two psukim that are written by a yoledis, by a woman who gave birth. Rashi over here says, Kroi ksivi beyoledis de bas kapari. Now, a woman who gives birth, she is an example of someone who is tamei, who brings a carbon. And what does the pasuk say? Ksiv, one pasuk says, Ad melos yemei tahara, until the days of her purification are over. And kevan shemalu yemei tahara. It sounds like when the days are over, that's purity. Uchsiv, and the pasuk also says, V'chiper aleha kohen v'tahara, that the kohen brings the carbon on her behalf, he atones on her behalf, and that's what creates the purity. So here also we have this contradiction. In one case, when the days of purity are over, it sounds like that's enough. You don't need the carbon to be pure. In the other pasuk, it sounds like you need the carbon to be pure. Haketzad, how so? Kan l'truma, kan l'kachim. Again, the same idea. By truma, it's going to be good enough when the days go by. You don't need to bring the carbon, but by kachim, you're going to need to bring the carbon. And the Gemara continues along similar lines. Ve'epachana, why don't we reverse it? Maybe we should say kachim is the one that's okay with bias shemesh, and truma you require the carbon. And the Gemara says, Mistabra Kodesh Chomer. It makes sense to say again that Kodesh is more strict than Truma. Shekain pancakes, again, that's the same acronym as before. The various things, Pigul, Nosor, etc., that are strict by Kodshim. The Gemara says, Adrab, and the contrary, Truma Chamura, Shekain Machbaz. Truma is stricter than Kodshim because, again, that's the acronym Machbaz, the things that are unique about Truma. And the Gemara says, Hanach Nafisha, and again, the acronym pancakes is more than Machbaz. There are more things that are unique by Kodshim. We said this earlier. And the Gemara continues, Rava Omar Rava says, below Hanach Nafishan Lo Matzes Amrit, even without saying that by Kodshim you have more things that make it unique, you still can't possibly say that it's by Truma that you wait for the carbon, and by Kodshim all you need is Bi'as Shemesh. Why? Because Omar Kra, because the pasuk says, V'chiper ala kohen v'tohera. It says that the carbon is brought and then she is pure. Mechlal she tameya. That does imply that there is some tumah before the carbon is brought. In other words, a person is considered, she's considered somewhat tameh before the carbon is brought. Now, if that's the case, if you say that all you need is harav shemesh by kodshim, but there's a pasuk that clearly says that any kind of tumah is a problem by kodshim, ikri kan, we should call over here the pasuk that says v'abosar asher yiga b'chol tameh lo yochal. It says any kind of tumah you can't eat when it comes to kodshim, and therefore again, if mechusar kippurim is called tameh in any way, there's no way that would be allowed by kodshim. So it has to be that mechusar kippurim is allowed by truma, and it has to be that by kodshim you have to bring the carbon. Rather, again, you see from here that the pasuk that allows it with just harif shemesh, that has to be by truma. And we'll take a look at Rashi over here, Kevan Shemalu Yameh, talking about counting the days for a woman who gave birth. Arboim l'zachru shmonim l'nekeva. Tahara, you count 40 days if she gives birth to a male, 80 days for a female. Vu harif shemesh alone. Those days are actually the equivalent of a harif shemesh in a normal situation. The mishas tevila l'sof shiva l'zachru shvuayim l'nekeva ad or havas karbonosel yom machri nikras tvulas yom orach. The halach is that from the time of the immersion, that takes place after 7 days for a male or 14 days, 2 weeks for a female. So from the time of the immersion until the time she brings the carbon, until the night before she brings the carbon, that's all called tvulas yom in the case of a woman who gives birth. But Mesechet Nida, that's a Mesechet Nida. Dumya dechol mechusre kapora hanikroim tvula yom orach mishas tvilos harav shemesh. That's the general rule. When they from the time of the immersion until the harav shemesh of the night before they bring the karbonos, that's considered a tvulas yom aruch or a tvul yom aruch. And the Gemara says kan l'truma, meaning baharav shemesh. By truma, that's harav shemesh. V'lekal remember kan l'maiser baharav shemesh. Now you can't possibly say that the pasuk of harav shemesh is by maiser. To amran leil harachatz tar. We already said the immersion alone is good for maiser. To lo boy harav shemesh. You don't need harav shemesh by the maiser. Ulinyan tvul yom mali bar kapara mali lav bar kapara. And if we're talking about a tvul yom already, so it wouldn't make any difference if you have to bring a carbon or not. That's not going to matter. So by maiser, again, tvul yom is going to be enough, and by truma you're going to need harav shemesh. And again, as we said, by kodshim you're going to need to actually bring the carbon. But the Gemara continues, Maskif lo Rav Shisha Breder Avidi. Rav Shisha Breder Avidi asks the following question: can you possibly say that this pasuk over here by Yoledis, by a woman who gives birth, is referring to truma at all? Vatanya, but we learned in a brisa, Daber el bnei Yisrael, to speak to bnei Yisrael. Ein li ela bnei Yisrael, I only know that we're talking about Jewish women who give birth, that these halachas apply, these halachas of tumah. Giores v'shifcha mishuchreres minayin. How do you know it applies to a giores, a woman who converted? How do you know it applies to a shifcha who was freed? Talmud lomar isha, the pasuk says isha to include these women as well in these various halachas. V'isal gadaitach betruma. Now, if you think that this pasuk is also talking about cleansing themselves in order to eat truma, giores v'shifcha benos mechal truma ninu. Do you think a giores and shifcha are allowed to eat truma? It can't be that the pasuk is talking about truma. As Rashi over here says, al bnei Yisrael isha kisazriya ainli al benos Yisrael metamos b'leida. I only know that benos Yisrael are tamei when they give birth. But how do you know it's true again by Gioris and Shifcha? And so the Gemara includes Gioris and Shifcha, but then the problem is they don't eat Truma, so how can we say the pasuk is talking about Truma? But Amar Rava, but Rava says Velo, but is the pasuk not including Truma? And we'll continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Ayin Hey Amud Aleph.